Now, you know the game. Attached you find a starting project, run npm install to install all dependencies we got in there, and once that is done and out of the way, you can run npm run serve to bring up that development server which hosts this demo app. Now, here's the app we'll be starting with, and to be honest, it's more of a playground than a real app. We got a modal here, which we can open and close, but it's really just there so that we can practice animations. But we'll not start with the modal, we'll start with this square, with this dark purple square here. And we'll see how we can animate that with CSS and also Vue. And then we'll also see where we need more support from Vue's side and how we get that support. So how can we animate things? Let's start simple. Let's say we want to click this animate button. And well, then this square here, this block should be animated. And for that, we can go back to our code, to app.vue, which is where I have this block, this div with the class block. And we'll start by adding a click listener to animate, so that we can write some Vue code that should do something with that div. And I want to start very, very simple. I want to start by simply moving that block a little bit to the left, let's say. To achieve this, we can add a new method. Animate block sounds like a fitting name for that. And that's the method which should be triggered upon a click. So let's wire this up. And I want to manage some data here, which basically controls whether we want to animate the block or not. So whether we clicked the button or not. Animated block is the data property I will add for that. And it's a simple boolean and starts with a false value. Now that's just one way of implementing this, but this is a very simple demo which we can build like this. So we got the animated block data property here in the app view file, and we can now utilize this data property to add a CSS class to this div conditionally, because we can animate things in web development with just CSS. We don't technically need JavaScript for it. We might just need JavaScript to start the animation, to add certain CSS code. But thereafter, CSS can do that on its own. So here, we could add a dynamic class binding to bind the animate class, let's say. This class name is up to you. Whenever animated block, so this newly added data property, is true. When that's true, the animate class will be added. And we can now define this animate class here in our styles. I'll add a brand new class, animate, and to move the block around, we can, for example, use the transform CSS property, which is a built-in CSS property, has nothing to do with Vue.js, and there we can add translate x to move an element around on the x-axis. And the transform property is perfect for that because it moves elements in an optimized way. It gives us great performance, essentially. So here we could move it by, let's say, 50 pixels. So now, to finish this up, we just need to go to this method we added before and set this animated block equal to true here. And with all of that, with that property, which we use to add the animate class dynamically, and that animate class defined down there. With all of that set up, if we save that, we can click animate and we see that block move a little bit. We can actually also move it a bit further by, for example, deducting 150 instead of 50 pixels. But what you'll see, of course, is that this is an instant jump. It's not an animation at all. It's just an instant jump to its new position. Now, this is not what I want here. I want a smooth animation. And implementing that is super easy with CSS. We can simply go to this block class, which is the base CSS class this div has. And on that block class here, we can add the transition CSS property, which is another built-in property CSS offers. It has nothing to do with Vue. The transition property takes a couple of values. It first of all wants to know which other CSS property we want to transition. For example, we could say that we want to animate the opacity. But here on this block, we're never changing the opacity, so this makes no sense. We can say all to animate any changes in any animatable CSS properties. Or we target transform specifically, since we know that we're going to change the transform property. Initially, on this base class, we're not saying anything about transform, and then later we set it to translate x minus 150 pixels. So when that kicks in, transition with the transform value here tells CSS that any changes applied to the transform property or with help of the transform property should be animated. And therefore, besides the name of the property we want to animate, we also have to provide a duration over which this animation should be done. For example, 0.3 seconds. Now, as a side note, if you want to learn more about that, the potential values you can set up here, and how CSS animations work, you might want to check out a dedicated CSS course or some free CSS animation resources which you find out there. I'll not dive too deeply into that here, since it's still a Vue course in the end and not primarily a CSS or CSS animations course. Nonetheless, here we now animate changes in transform over 0.3 seconds. And we can define an easing function, which basically determines how this animation accelerates and then throttles at the end. If we now save that, you'll see if I click animate, now this animates and this moves in the duration we specified. And we are using Vue here to start this animation by setting animated block to true. Initially it's false, but we set it to true here. And that adds the animate class. So that's the part where we use Vue. But thereafter it's just CSS. And it's just the transform property combined with the transition property. And that's important. This is a perfectly fine way. It's not just fine, it's actually the recommended way for adding animations like this. Now, there is an alternative for cases where a simple transition like that is not enough, though. Let me show you that alternative as well.